Henry could have been a carrier of the infection, passed it on to his wives through sex, who then in turn passed it on to their children without anybody knowing about it.
For centuries, historians told us King Henry VIII died from gluttony, pride, and power. But what if the truth was far more terrifying? What if England's most infamous monarch, the man who shattered the church, who executed wives and friends alike, wasn't driven by ambition alone, but by something darker, something written in his very blood?
The thing that affected his health the most is his obesity. He had increasingly a problem with his legs. He also suffered from constipation. He developed a lot of ulcers. He may have had some problems with insulin deficiency.
Before we proceed, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because history, when stripped of its royal lies, reveals something shocking. The Golden Prince. When Henry became king in 1509, he was just 17. A towering figure, 6'2", athletic, radiant. He could joust with the finest knights, compose music that stirred hearts, and charm an entire court with a single smile. England had found its Golden Prince, a new Arthur, a Renaissance ideal made flesh. But that light would not last. By the time of his death in 1547, the man who once inspired nations had become something monstrous, bloated, diseased, paranoid, and cruel. The question has haunted historians for 5 centuries. What happened to him? How did the radiant prince become the tyrant king? The fall begins. The day began with celebration, armor gleaming, banners flying. But one moment changed everything. As the king thundered down the tilt-yard, his horse stumbled. A 200-pound mass of steel and muscle came crashing down, and the world's most powerful monarch was crushed beneath it. Henry lay unconscious for 2 hours. When he awoke, his courtiers rejoiced, but they had no idea the man who opened his eyes that day would never be the same again. The monster emerges. Within months, his temper turned volcanic. He flew into rages over nothing. He accused, executed, and distrusted everyone. The same man who once wrote love songs now issued death warrants. His leg ulcers began to fester, open, oozing wounds that refused to heal. The stench followed him everywhere. Courtiers could tell when the king was near by the smell alone. And then came the loss that shattered him. Just 11 days after that fateful accident, Queen Anne Boleyn miscarried a son. A male heir, gone. To Henry, it felt like divine punishment. To modern science, it was the first sign of something far more sinister. The curse in the bloodline. In 2011, researchers uncovered the genetic secret buried in Henry's bloodline, a secret that had cursed not only the king, but his unborn sons. They found evidence that Henry carried a rare blood type known as Kell positive. Only 9% of people have it. It sounds harmless until you understand what it does. When a Kell positive father conceives a child with a Kell negative mother, the first baby may survive, but after that, the mother's body becomes a battlefield. Her immune system begins attacking any future Kell-positive fetuses, treating them as enemies. The result? Miscarriages, stillbirths, tiny hearts that stop beating around the 6th or 7th month, exactly when Henry's queens kept losing their babies. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, 2 women, 2 tragedies, identical outcomes. It wasn't coincidence, it was inheritance, a genetic curse hidden in the veins of England's greatest king. The madness in his mind. The Kell blood disorder explained the lost children, but it didn't explain the madness, the paranoia, the cruelty, the transformation from scholar and poet to the butcher of his own court. The answer, scientists now believe, lies in another mutation, something called McLeod syndrome, a genetic time bomb carried on the X chromosome. It begins quietly, but around middle age, it attacks the body and the mind at once. Muscles weaken, the heart begins to fail, and the brain, the very seat of reason, starts to deteriorate. The patient becomes paranoid, anxious, erratic, a stranger in his own skin. Henry was 44 when his personality began to unravel. The timing is chilling. This wasn't corruption by power. This was biology waging war against his mind. The rotting king. The ulcers that covered Henry's legs were more than wounds. They were symbols of decay. For 11 years they festered. Physicians cauterized the flesh with red-hot irons, the king's screams echoing through Whitehall. But nothing helped. His circulation was failing. His weight ballooned to nearly 400 pounds. Each step was agony, each breath a struggle. Contemporary accounts describe him as monstrous, his body collapsing under its own mass, his skin ulcerated, his once handsome face swollen and crimson with disease. He had to be lifted with pulleys just to move. He slept upright to keep from suffocating, and the smell of rotting flesh clung to him like a shroud. The mind that turned on itself. Imagine the torment of a man watching his children die again and again. Imagine believing that every death was your fault, that God himself had cursed your soul. Henry interpreted tragedy through faith. He believed he was being punished for his sins, for marrying his brother's widow, for defying the Pope, for breaking Christendom in half. He couldn't know that it wasn't divine wrath. It was DNA. And as the disease ravaged his brain, his paranoia deepened. He executed friends and wives alike, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, each death another symptom of a mind in collapse. He was no longer the radiant prince. He had become something else, a man consumed by pain, by madness, by his own blood. The Dying Giant. By January 1547, Henry VIII was dying, 55 years old, 400 pounds, ravaged by infection, diabetes, heart failure, and madness. His body was so enormous it took a reinforced coffin to contain him. He died believing his suffering was punishment. He never knew it was science. The truth was written in his genes, a double curse that robbed him of reason and condemned his dynasty to despair. The ancestral curse. The genetic trail leads back to Jacquetta of Luxembourg, Henry's great-grandmother. A duchess whispered to be a witch, but her true legacy was not sorcery. It was heredity. Through her veins passed the Kell gene, silent, invisible, waiting for a descendant powerful enough to carry it to its terrible end. Henry VIII wasn't cursed by demons. He was cursed by inheritance. Every miscarriage, every rage, every act of tyranny was written in his DNA centuries before his birth. The truth in his blood. For 500 years, we believed Henry VIII's downfall was his own making, but modern science tells another story, one of a man doomed from conception, his brilliance destroyed by his own biology. Was he a monster? Yes, but was he also a victim? A prisoner inside a decaying mind, fighting battles his body had already lost. The truth complicates everything. It doesn't excuse the blood he spilled, but it reveals the greater tragedy, that England's golden prince was consumed not by greed or lust, but by a disease written in his very being. In the end, the truth wasn't buried with his crown. It was hidden in his blood. And now, after 5 centuries, science has finally read what history could not. Implications of this discovery. For centuries, the death of King Henry VIII has been cloaked in royal myth, a tale told through portraits and propaganda, polished by time and pride. The story of the man who reshaped England, who defied the Pope, who made himself head of the Church, was supposed to end as the death of a powerful monarch. But now, nearly 500 years later, DNA evidence is rewriting that story, and what it reveals is far darker than any historian dared to admit. This is not the death of a king. It is the unmasking of a curse, written not in prophecy, but in the blood of the Tudor line itself. Would you like me to continue this style into a voice-over-ready narration script with scene direction and pacing cues for editing or YouTube production? Or keep it in this cinematic documentary prose format for now?
When modern geneticists examined preserved samples believed to contain traces of Henry VIII's DNA, a disturbing pattern emerged. What they found suggests the king suffered from McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that affects the nervous system, the blood, and even the mind. A condition that can twist behavior, destabilize emotion, and slowly consume the body from within. Suddenly, the stories of Henry's violent rages, his paranoia, his mood swings, and his mysterious ulcers began to make haunting sense. The king who sent wives to the scaffold, who turned on friends and counselors, who became a shadow of himself in his final years, was not just a tyrant shaped by power. He was a man tormented by his own blood. It explains the obesity that crushed his legs. It explains the infections that refused to heal. It explains the madness that seemed to rise like a tide inside his mind until the line between faith and fury vanished entirely. But the implications stretch beyond Henry himself. If his DNA carried such a rare and devastating disorder, then his descendants may have carried it too, an invisible legacy of pain woven into Europe's royal families. The once divine bloodline of the Tudors may have been, in truth, a genetic time bomb. Historians have long debated why Henry's marriages ended in tragedy, why his wives miscarried, and why so few of his children survived infancy. But if his DNA was compromised, then the curse of the Tudors wasn't divine punishment. It was biological inevitability. His desperate search for a male heir may have been doomed from the start. What if the Reformation itself, the splitting of the English Church, the wars, the executions, the rise and fall of nations, was all set in motion by the instability in one man's veins? What if England's greatest upheaval began not in politics, but in mutated cells? The DNA doesn't lie. It tells of a man at war with his own body. It tells of a kingdom that suffered because his king could not control his mind. And it whispers something chilling, that behind the glittering crowns and divine decrees, even kings are prisoners of their biology. The discovery forces history to look again at the myth of Henry VIII, not as the unstoppable monarch who bent heaven and earth to his will, but as a man undone by his flesh, a ruler who tore a nation apart searching for salvation, when the real battle was raging inside him all along.